Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. In the background I just have some MCOC and chill videos from the past, so you have something to look at while I kind of rant. Fair warning, this might get a little bit cyclic, so I apologize in advance. But what I want to talk about today is the fact that damage is no longer a selling point like it used to be, and it's more of a baseline expectation for a champion to be playable. Even just to use a champion, there's a baseline expectation of damage that needs to be present for them to be, well, usable for the most part. And it used to be that damage was a major selling point. You could say just off of damage this champion is viable. You know, back in like the Act 4 days and like pressing into the Act 5 days, damage could push you through. But as we reach into more and more diverse nodes and different kinds of champions requiring specific counters, damage is not an okay answer anymore. You can't just raw power your way through content anymore. That's the new stage of the game. But even looking at the champions who have these insane damage numbers, it's not just the insane damage number that makes them so good. Because if that were the fact, Proxima Midnight and Sunspot would be two of the strongest champions in the game. And don't get me wrong, Proxima Midnight and Sunspot are two amazing champions. They're not the two best because damage isn't the most, highest factor selling point when we're discussing the value of a champion. Even champions who are known for their huge damage outputs, especially in a short period of time, like Corvus Glaive, have a lot more utility to them that makes them such a strong sell. And ignoring the amount of utility that those champions have means you're losing out on a lot of potential there because you're really just fixating on something that should be just a base expectation of playing the game, right? If you have one champion that takes 500 hits and one takes 20, obviously you're going to go with the champion that takes 20 hits. But when you have 30 champions who all take somewhere between 20 to 40 hits to end a fight, the conversation changes, right? It's about, well, what else does that champion offer? And that's why like Corvus Glaive still retains his value because Awakened, he's essentially dot immune. Even if it's for a short period of time, essentially you cannot die to damage over time effects as long as you can end the fight before you run out of glaive charges. That's solid. He's got the True Strike, the anti-evade on him. He's got the huge damage output, which allows you to end fights very quickly, which is important in things like Alliance War and Alliance Quest, where you do have a timer on you. You've got pseudo bleed immunity for as long as you have the glaive charges. You've got, and that's like more important than the just general damage over time effect immunity, because like this will actually let you heal from willpower, giving you kind of like a sustain over time, getting a lot of, long-term value out of Corvus Glaive, as well as defensive triggered armor break. Which you can use to counter things like Iceman or Emma Frost or Killmonger, etc. Especially with like the introduction of like turning off offensive ability accuracy, Corvus Glaive is someone who can just work his way around that. So when you recognize that, yeah, it's easy to fixate and say, yeah, Corvus Glaive, people rank him up because his damage is insane. No, the reality is people rank Corvus Glaive up because his utility is so far reaching and his damage allows him to end fights quickly enough that his broad utility is valuable there. Even other champions like Domino or Cap Infinity War, they have so much more utility. I think Domino is another really good example of a high damage output champion that people don't fixate enough on the utility she offers, right? Like if you're using Domino versus like Nick Fury, which is a very common fight you have to take in Alliance War, her Unlucky works against the tactical charges, making it so that being a mutant plus the Unlucky is like free damage on Nick Fury, free damage for Domino, and allows you to constantly not have to worry about tactical charges. Also, like a lot of her damage comes from the Red Hulk synergy, so you get a free incinerate there. That bypasses things like Safeguard. You also have, the anti-limber mechanic with Massacre. You've got big bleeds, so a lot of her damage comes from damage over time effects, which is very, very useful if you're going up against like a high armor champion, etc., because that damage kind of bypasses that defense mechanic. So Domino, like there's a lot of utility, even though it's utility that's just supplementing her big damage, it's still utility that's present there. And that's something I really want to emphasize is, yes, when these champions were first coming out and we were seeing that power creep of damage numbers getting higher and higher, damage was a huge selling point. That was a selling point. Big damage numbers we've never seen before. Damage numbers, that are absolutely insane and crazy and mind-blowing that, are off the charts. But I think around when Cull Obsidian came into play, that started changing, right? Cull Obsidian's damage numbers were insane. They were off the charts. but it didn't matter. A lot of like end game players were still like, yeah, Cull Obsidian's amazing, but they don't use him. And the reason they don't use him is because he doesn't have, the sustainability to last through fights, even once you've ramped him up. And that's despite his solid armor break utility, his true strike ability, and his overall like general use, with that huge damage. And it's because he's a glass cannon. He's a glass cannon that relies on parrying and the parry heavy playstyle. And once every time you parry, you're still taking a ton of damage. It's just not worth it when it's still going to take you a lot of hits to end a fight. So it kind of just shows this like shift from the damage meta into like an overall utility meta, where every champion comes out, the first question is, well, do they do enough damage to be relevant? Because you've got so many champions who don't do enough damage to be relevant, like Tyrax, where like the damage numbers on Tyrax are incredibly underwhelming. Even if you play him like in quote unquote an optimal rotation with like the whole special 2 heavy, the damage output is still fairly slow enough that I would consider him not usable as an attacker, but good enough that you can still slip him in on defense for that diversity, hence my rank 5 Tyrax. But the reason I'm using him as an example is the fights are just so unbelievably slow. It doesn't matter if you're constantly proccing invulnerability, rotating a special 2 rotation, where essentially you do special 2, you use the invulnerabilities to do some parries, build them up to a special 1, you throw a parry heavy, and then you use the special 1 dexing and then punishment to throw another special 2, so you have a continual rotation of never taking damage. That's the optimal way to play Tyrax. It's just not good enough because it takes so long to get through that rotation that it's not worth the time investment. Dormammu was another example of an amazing power control king who just gets overshadowed by the fact that his damage, they're not there. He's got so much utility, but the damage just doesn't meet that baseline expectation that players want and need to see in order to use a champion frequently. Now, he still gets used. You still see a lot of Dormammu used in the game, especially to counter particular nodes, or, if you're looking for that bleed and poison immune, he's got good sustain as well, and, you double dip with that defender rank up. But when you compare him to people like Clairvoyant or Doom or Sim Supreme, who are also power control kings and queens, who just have a higher damage threshold / different utilities that they offer, Dormammu he falls a little shy. And that's the reality. But when we talk about even those 3, Doom, Claire, and Sim Supreme, they have so much other utility. Like, damage isn't the focus there. Sim Supreme being a Nullify King and a Bleeder, power drain control. You've got Claire with the Nullify, of course, and the double immunities, and the huge regen. Dr. Doom being one of the best power control champions in the game. If they didn't have these factors to them, they wouldn't be amazing. And it's the utility that makes them amazing, and the damage that makes them playable. And I understand, that I'm splitting hairs here. I understand that it doesn't really matter, right? It's both, it's hand in hand. I just want to stress the focus on utility. I think that a lot of people high focus on damage too much. And yes, there's a baseline amount of damage that needs to be output in order for a champion to feel good and feel usable, but also, don't forget the utility. And actually, I would much rather you prefer, when we talk about these god tier, high demigod tier champions, we talk about the utility, because the utility comes first in my book. And as we push higher and higher content where, damage numbers become less and less relevant, because it's going to take 100, 200, 300 hits, and 300 hits versus 450 hits, it starts to be less relevant the higher number of hits that matter. That's when I want to talk about utility more, the value of a champion, the tankability of a champion, the survivability, the mistake or ease of use. These are relevant factors that I feel like don't get talked about enough, or don't get hyped enough, rather. They're talked about, but they're kind of under this radar of big yellow numbers. So that said, I know this was a little ranty, but it's just been on my mind, and I wanted to share my thoughts with all of you. Let me know what you think. Maybe there's other champions you really like to point out who maybe don't meet the damage curve, but offer so much utility you want to, stress their value. And I'll talk to you all later. Peace.